The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone around the world. Welcome to the Global Network on Environment and Oil and Gas webinar series. My name is Marisol Estrella. I coordinate the Disaster Risk Reduction Program at the Crisis Management Branch in UN Environment. And I'm usually based in Geneva, but today I'm calling in from Nairobi, our headquarters. It's a real pleasure to have you today. I see that there are 351 people online, so welcome and thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is our second webinar in our series, and it's focusing in particular on environmental impact assessments for upstream oil and gas operations. And we wanted to bring this particular attention to all of you, because people are always asking what are the potential impacts of potential environmental and social impacts of oil and gas exploration and production, especially in countries where there is an emerging oil and gas sector. So we thought we would invite some very good experts to our team today and to have this very good discussion. So this webinar will focus on environmental considerations and some of the challenges that we face when conducting EIAs for upstream oil and gas projects. And hopefully we will be able to draw from experiences from different countries, and in particular from practitioners' point of view in Kenya in particular. So this webinar is being organized together with UN Environment and the Environment Institute of Kenya, with support from Norway's Oil for Development program. Some of you may be wondering how UN Environment is involved in this sector. While indeed, of course, UN Environment's long-term goal is to reduce fossil fuel reliance to fight climate change, we are also cognizant that oil and gas will remain part of our global energy mix in the foreseeable future. So for us, it's really important to ensure then that oil and gas are produced in a socially and environmentally acceptable manner and do not impact negatively on local communities. So in this regard, we are collaborating with Norway's Oil for Development program, which works in 14 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where we are providing capacity building and technical assistance on environmental best practice in oil and gas exploration and production. An important part of our work with Norway is also to help disseminate knowledge and best practice through global outreach, such as through this webinar series. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce our team. Let me start with Chidima Zikoria, who is part of the UN Environment team in our office in Geneva, who has helped bring together this webinar. So there's Chidima that you can see.
Hello.
And one of our presenters will be Ms. Rita Miwidiwe, who is a health and safety environment professional with a chemical and process engineering background. Rita has over 20 years of experience in oil and gas industry, is specializing in process safety and design and implementation of HSE management systems. She is affiliated right now with Environment Institute of Kenya. Our second presenter today will be Dr. Matthew Richmond, who is a marine scientist with over 18 years of working experience looking at oil and gas and environment issues, and has worked in a number of regions, including off the coast of Ireland, the Arabian Gulf, and particularly in East Africa. So it is really my pleasure to have you both and all of you in our team so that we can have a fantastic webinar today. So just to bring everyone on board in terms of how we're going to conduct our webinar, we will start with presentations first. Matt and Rita will take turns giving presentations. So you should be able to see the slides on your screen. And then there is a chat room. So for those of you who are online, your chat room is should be on your right-hand side, where you can post questions. And what I will do is take some relevant questions that we can address today after the presentations, and we'll make sure we have enough time for some questions and answers from our presenters. I just wanted to inform everyone that the webinar is being recorded, and hopefully we will have it online shortly. So for those of you, again, who have just joined in, welcome to our EIA webinar. And please stay until the very end because there will be instructions on how to receive a certificate of participation. So with that, I would like to invite Matt to start with your presentation, please. Go ahead.
Thank you, Marisol. Good afternoon, most of you out there. As Marisol mentioned, this is the EIA lecture on upstream oil and gas. What I'm going to describe to you with the help of Rita is the EIA mandate and the background with respect to the oil and gas activities. Now, I should say that we use the term EIA, apologies for that, Environmental Social Impact Assessment. That's the most commonly used term now, but EIA simply was used a lot in the past. Then legislation and upstream activities, the oil and gas companies, the main steps in the EIAs, material and waste, environmental settings and types of impacts in the upstream sector, key trends and issues. Oh, Christ. I think now you're seeing my screen, is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, now we can see your screen. I was about to tell you.
Okay, so the contents, once more briefly, the mandate and the background, legislation and activities, oil and gas companies, main steps, materials and waste, environmental settings and types of impacts, key trends and issues, international best practice and guidance, EIA consultants and challenges that they face, where Rita will be particularly contributing towards, the oil and gas contribution to knowledge, and common features, weaknesses, and the main steps going forwards. So we start with the first EIAs. As some of you probably know, it was only really at the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development in 1992 that EIAs were formally recognized as a national instrument to be undertaken for proposed activities that are likely to have a significant adverse impact on the environment and are subject to a decision of a competent national authority. Those are the words from the declaration back in '92. The EIA system itself identifies and evaluates potential impacts. That's the real crux of it on physical, biological, chemical, social, and health. Once you've got the impacts identified, to develop mitigation measures to eliminate, minimize, or reduce those impacts. Though the first EIAs started around the 1970s, it was only from the Rio Declaration onwards that EIA was incorporated into procedures of most governments and major development organizations, including lending, financing institutions. Much of the legislation in the countries from where you are, including many countries that I worked in, really was first drafted in the early 2000s. Here are a couple of examples. On the top left of the screen is a front page of the regulation on EIAs from Tanzania, which is dated 2004. I believe Kenya has one of a similar date. On the right-hand side, there's one from Mozambique. Now, this was updated in 2015, and the first one also came out around about 2004. So some countries are already realizing that the EIA legislation needs to be updated, and that's taking place in a lot of countries around the world at the moment. And the bottom left of the screen, there's a legislation from the Sindh Environmental Protection Agency in Pakistan, where they have their own regional legislation, and that is dated from 2014 as well, so fairly recent. But for most countries pre-2000, there was no EIAs. So what we do discover is that, for example, in East Africa, there were a range of exploration activities taking place in the 60s and 70s. I think in Tanzania, for example, something like 20 wells were drilled, seismic surveys were conducted. But at that time, there was no requirement for EIAs. So there's nothing in the literature describing what took place in those events. Now, the oil and gas sector typically has 4 different phases. We start with exploration, and that is based on seismic and exploration drilling. Usually this takes 2 or 3 years. From exploration, we move on to development, where more drilling takes place and installations of pipelines are constructed. That's usually 3 to 5 years. Then the real interesting part begins with production, processing and export. Depending on the size of the field, that can last between 10 and 30 years. When the gas or the oil field is finally expired, what takes place is called decommissioning. And this can take 5 to 10 years. Of course, it depends on where the activity is taking place. If it's on shore, if it's in the coastal zone, or if it's offshore, then some of these steps can be longer. But overall, between 20 and 48 years for a single hydrocarbon field. So that's the kind of standard range of time you'd expect oil and gas production to take place. Now, upstream oil and gas. When we say upstream, here we're really focusing on 3 main activities: seismic surveys, exploration drilling, and pipelines. Okay, the next step beyond that, for gas at least, is gas processing plants, which some might consider to be an upstream activity, but you are beginning to modify the product, certainly removing water. And then LNG, which definitely is a processing event. And then, of course, with crude oil, you get into crude oil processing plants, from which you'll derive all the various products that we're all familiar with. But for this presentation, we're really focusing on these 3 main areas of activity: seismic surveys, exploration drilling, and pipelines. Now, what's happening in the industry at the moment is quite interesting. And we all need to be aware that as oil and gas, the easy access supplies are somewhat depleted, exploration is taking place in deeper waters. That adds a whole suite of risks in more protected areas than ever before, in transition zones. And when we say transition zones, we mean these awkward areas which are not deep sea and they're not on land. They're shallow. They can be in marshes, in estuaries, around coral reefs. These shallow areas are called transition zones. And also exploration is now, as you probably heard from the media, taking place in the Arctic areas more than ever before, especially in the north. Nevertheless, oil and gas is a key driver of the offshore economy, but there are unwanted environmental impacts that potentially threaten long-term environmental and economic viability of marine ecosystems. I emphasize marine here because, as I say above, there's a lot more going on in the marine environment these days. The early fields, the early finds were on land, of course. You imagine the old pictures of the 1930s and 40s in Texas. Those are all on land, fairly straightforward operations. But now there's a lot more going on in the marine environment. There's still drilling going on land. Impacts, however, are more complex now and larger in scale and further reaching than 30 years ago when ESAs were first introduced, partly because of the areas that they're now exploring. But ESAs are needed to reduce the burden of impacts if development is to be sustainable. Now, returning to legislation, I have an example here from Lebanon and Norway. If we start with the right-hand column, that represents Norway. In 1997, there was a revised Petroleum Act that decided that instead of having individual EIAs for every single activity, they're going to have regional impact assessments, which are prepared by the licensees or the companies to obtain the best possible overview of environmental impacts over a wider area. Now, there's a good case for this. It's very tedious for the regulators to be dealing with an EIA for seismic, an EIA for one well, an EIA for another well, an EIA for more seismic. If you adopt the regional approach, it simplifies a lot of the operation for the proponent, but also for the regulator. Then there are also field-specific EIAs. So if there's a new oil or gas field, an EIA will be conducted to cover that field and all activities that took place in that field. EIAs will only be used in Norway when they open up new areas. Now, the main reason for this approach is that it's instead of the bit-by-bit assessment, as I mentioned, and that there are an increasing number of satellite developments, small activities, another well, another test, for example, which would otherwise lead to lots and lots of small EIAs, which are very time-consuming. It improves the overall assessment, and particularly, it increases efficiency and creates simplification. So that's how Norway is doing it at the moment. They have drilled over 500 wells, so they have some experience. In Lebanon, at the other extreme, there have been no oil and gas wells drilled in Lebanon. Now, at least recently. So what they're doing now in Lebanon makes perfect sense, is they're developing a strategic environmental assessment, or an SEA. And this is actually out for public consultation right now. And it opens on the 1st of May. So we're talking current. And the draft strategic environmental assessment for the exploration and production activities offshore Lebanon is available online for public consultation. So what they're doing there is a bit like the Norway strategy, is they're doing an overview of a strategic environmental assessment for the whole offshore sector, which will simplify the individual EIAs per block or per activity. And it's just beginning, so watch this space, and good luck, Lebanon, with your oil and gas adventure. China is another case study where, as we know, it's got one of the fastest economy growths in the world the last 25 years, averaging 10%. But this growth requires massive levels of energy and resources. Levels of exploration and investment in oil and gas are increasing in China and elsewhere, as are industrialization, pollution, and damage to natural environment. The challenge in China and in many countries where the oil and gas sector is beginning to take a foothold is to plan and manage exploitation of resources to satisfy the demand whilst conserving biodiversity and safeguarding ecosystem health and services. Impact assessment at both level, the ESIA and the planning policy level, the Strategic Environmental Assessment, or SEA, as they're doing in Lebanon, is a useful tool to predict, assess, mitigate, and manage likely impacts. So who's involved? Meet the oil and gas sector. Some of you who work in this field will get to know, at the moment, there are the 5 big international oil companies, IOCs, or the super majors, which are Shell, Exxon, BP, Chevron, and Total. These are really the big players in the sector. And many of their investments are in the billions of dollars, active all around the world. There are also many medium-sized IOCs, companies like Petrobras from Brazil, Eni from Italy, Equinor, or ex-Statoil from Norway, Woodside from Australia, Morland Prompt French, and Anadarko USA. These companies also are active around the world, and some of them are probably active in some of your countries. Then there are hundreds of smaller companies, a few that I've been associated with, Ophir and Tullow Oil, both from the UK, ConocoPhillips and USA, Petronas from Malaysia, Qatar Petroleum, and many more small startup companies. There, in some parts of the world, in the United States, for example, you and I can form a company tomorrow and get a license to explore. You only need half a dozen people. In other parts of the world, it's a bit more complicated. There are still several national companies of various sizes where the state has the majority in the company, and they tend to partner with some of the larger IOCs. Some of you may have heard of Gazprom, PetroChina, CNOOC from China, Saudi Aramco, Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, National Iranian Oil Company, and Petróleos Mexicanos. So it's useful to get familiar with some of these players, particularly because depending on who they are, they have different policies and they have a different approach and different internal processes to actually conduct their exploration. So exploration blocks, this is where it all begins. Most countries around the world have conducted some sort of surveys in the past, and they end up designing a block like this one. This is the coast of Tanzania. I'm not sure if you can see the cursor, but this is the island of Pemba, the island of Zanzibar here, and then the coastline stretching all the way down to Mtwara in Mozambique. There are 12 offshore blocks and a number of onshore and coastal blocks. This is typical around the world, where companies, they bid for certain blocks at gatherings every few years, and then you and I can be awarded a block where we then have a commitment to begin our exploration. Usually it'll start with seismic, and then it'll go on to drilling. What usually happens is, number one here, often some of the smaller companies start the exploration. And this happened a lot in East Africa, where, for example, on land, you might only need to put together $15, $20 million to drill one well. It's much more expensive offshore, but a small company can do that on land. After discovery of reservoirs, a small company may then sell the asset to large companies, or they may retain a certain proportion, but hand over the operation to a larger company. Larger companies who can afford the huge cost of development of the resource may join together. You might find Shell with BP or Exxon with Anadarko, and usually also with a national company to then go on and undertake the development. Usually one international company is the license holder. As I mentioned before, this is an important note. Standards, policies, integrity, principles, and shareholder obligations differ significantly between companies, especially between the big five and national or small startup companies. This has implications on quality and transparency. For example, if you're a shareholder in one of the big five majors and the fantastic and fast internet media that we have today reports within a few minutes of some kind of accident, that potentially will affect the share price of your company. Smaller companies are less susceptible to that. But that's a fantastic thing about the modern technology in the media, is that news spreads much faster now than it did 20, 30 years ago. Now, not all companies, even the big ones, they don't pay for exploration activity from their own pocket. They tend to borrow money from banks or financial institutions. And there is a system now called the Equator Principles, which is a very valuable, what they call a management framework, and it's adopted by financial institutions for determining, assessing, and managing environmental and social risk in projects. So a bank who would like to finance a project in some far-flung corner of the world will have its own process for assessing risk. And when they mean by risk, environmental and social risk, this also includes impacts on the environment and on the social fabric of the place where the drilling or exploration is taking place. Linked with that is another international finance corporation, which is a World Bank Group office finance company that supports businesses around the world operating on a commercial basis for profit projects. So we're talking business, including oil and gas exploration and production. Now, the good thing about the IFC is that they would insist, if they're financing a project, that the EIA is done to their standard. That doesn't mean it's going to be a weak EIA. It'll mean that it will have to satisfy the national requirements and go, in most cases, beyond the national requirements, especially with respect to impacts and mitigation. So preparing the ESIA to IFC standards requires more work, more detail, more analysis, and takes much longer to complete. Some of you who are practitioners in the sector will know early on when you're tendering for some work, you want to know, does the client want the EIA to IFC standards or not? You can visit the website for IFC standards, and there are a number of standards that deal with everything from the environment to indigenous people and stakeholder representation and the rest. One of the IFC standards that we tend to refer to a lot from my sector is IFC standard number 6, which is biodiversity conservation and the sustainable management of living natural resources. That was published in 2012. This is used a lot, and it's recently been updated to make it even more stringent with respect to things like critical habitat assessment and the mitigation hierarchy. We'll get onto those in a few minutes. Okay, the steps for the EIA and the concerns are the following. This is a standard EIA procedure that many of you are familiar with. This one actually comes from Mozambique. It shows all the steps from registration to the scoping report to the EIA. Those are the main bits that the proponents do. Those of us who have worked in this sector are very familiar with all the rushing around and the deadlines associated with getting the registration in, starting the process, conducting the scoping phase and submitting the scoping report, and then moving on to the whole EIA final to the end point where the environmental license is issued. During this process, the important elements from my perspective are contact between the proponent and the regulator. This is where it begins. The cost of the ESA is determined. The duration and certainty of the ESA and the delays in ministerial signing are issues that frequently come up. The technical understanding within the regulator review team is sometimes a problem, and site visit logistics and challenges associated with that. These are typical concerns that come up during the standard process. The generic ESA steps, as those of you know, have 5 main steps. I'm not going to read through them all now, but application and screening, scope and report, scoping phase, as I've mentioned. I'll just go back one here. This is where stakeholder engagement begins, and this is important because stakeholder engagement should continue throughout the EIA process. Then there's the impact assessment mitigation phase, which results in the environmental impact statement or equivalent document, ESA review and disclosure, decision-making on the EIA certification, and then the certificate and the conditions. That's what the client wants. Following that is monitoring and audit. One thing that you'll come across very soon with a drilling EIA is there are a number of products which are used. And some of them are user-friendly and some of them are not so user-friendly, depending on where the drilling takes place. The details are there. They're just typical examples, but we must remember that also explosives are used for testing the well, and so are radioactive materials. So we mustn't underestimate the level of hazard and risk associated with some of the chemicals. Stakeholder engagement is a critical part, and a stakeholder engagement plan is needed to ensure that the engagement is undertaken in a systematic manner, that it improves the ESA process and builds relationships whilst managing expectations. More on that later. Responsibility is usually with the public. Public participation is usually with the proponent, but authorities may be involved. Local marine resource users tend to be people on the coast, obviously, who may not be represented, may be illiterate, include farmers, fishers, traders, mangrove cutters. On land, they can be the similar kind of folk: herders, farmers, woodcutters, charcoal makers, beekeepers, herbal doctors, tour guides, hoteliers, small-scale miners, and others. Impacts in the marine and terrestrial environment. Well, there are a number here. On the left-hand side, we have marine, and on the right, we have terrestrial. So you can see from the list that they do with entanglement and impact on marine life and access to habitat fragmentation and roads and waste and litter, and that there are best practices, and most of which can easily accommodate and mitigate some of the standard impacts from seismic surveys. Now, not always the proponent would want to delay the survey because of migrating whales, but if you're following best practice, that's what he should do. Impacts on drilling, there are atmospheric emissions, discharges, noise and dust, light, waste, access to remote protected areas, invasive species, accidental events. Again, with best practice, all can be reduced or eliminated. Water-based drilling mud disposal is an issue for drilling on land. Drilling at sea, similar kind of impacts, but marine invasive species, discharges, accidental events, Gulf of Mexico, we know about that. Again, most can be eliminated, certainly reduced. The waste from one well includes usually hundreds of tons of rock cuttings, more from the lower section of the hole than the upper section of the hole. The upper section of the hole is wider, creates greater volumes. There's all sorts of slops and sludges and waste oil, scrap metals, recyclable plastics and pallets, gas discharges. And the most controversial element is the cuttings when drilling offshore using oil-based muds. This tends to be circulated up to the ship where it can be cleaned, and the oil on cuttings reduced to less than 7%. On land, water-based mud is used, and generally speaking, once the drilling is over, the land can be rehabilitated and the cuttings can be buried. There is a case study from Songo Island in Tanzania, where myself and colleagues have worked, where you can see here the waste elements are in orange. Oil waste, food waste, plastics, sewage, oil scrap, saline water, solid waste, liquid mud, oil mud, rock cuttings, waste cement. On Songo Island, all the materials have to be supplied by sea. That has additional risks. There's also a local community there with the village, which interacts with the camp and interacts with the drilling site. So it's only when you really get involved, you begin to understand all the relationships that go on a drill location, on a small island, where there's a local population. It can be quite complex. Emissions and discharges at sea from deep sea drilling are similar, but you've got the additional movement of supply ships backwards and forwards to the port, helicopters backwards and forwards to an airport, and a lot of discharges that take place in the ocean on site. There is a number of waste which is transported back to shore, which can be handled if there are facilities. Generally speaking, the biggest impact from offshore drilling is the discharge of cuttings, treated cuttings, and smothering of marine life on the seabed. Accidental events excluded, of course. Slightly controversial related to that is the cuttings disposal in the deep sea. Nowadays, there are more sophisticated non-aqueous drilling fluids which have a high drilling performance, less toxic, more biodegradable than early generation diesel. And the favored option, cost-wise, of course, is to discharge into the sea once it's been cleaned. Others include injection or transportation to shore. The largest impact, as I mentioned on the previous graphic, is on the benthic community on the seabed. The impacts there are due to the toxicity of the fluid that remains in the cuttings, oxygen depletion due to biodegradation and sediment, and the actual physical impact from burial or changes in grain size. Generally, recovery on the seabed begins within a year. The conclusions are that discharges to sea are still the best environmental option. This is according to the Environmental Aspects Study report of the oil producer, 2003. But in some parts of the world, discharge at sea is illegal and all cuttings have to be taken to shore. Impacts from pipelines, fairly standard, onshore, cuttings, habitat fragmentation, invasive species, similarly at sea from sedimentation, disrupting of benthic communities, accidental leakage. Generally speaking, practice can handle most of these impacts, and burial, site restoration tend to suffice. Waste management is relevant to all activities, and hazardous chemicals or waste. The challenge here is that there's often a lack of accredited local facilities and potentially unscrupulous local waste contractors. And that has and does cause accidents during transportation. Cradle to grave is the best philosophy, and in some cases, the actual proponent needs to assist local companies to set up the facilities or send it elsewhere. Collecting baseline data at sea, there are various different methods of doing that. And the importance of baseline data, as I mentioned earlier, is vital for some of the assessments and the requirements of the IFC and other lenders. Data on species, habitats, ecological systems, current conditions and status, and the trends are important to be known before studies commence. And this information is also very important for applying a mitigation hierarchy, which you will hear about in the next few years, because this is becoming more and more of a requirement. Collecting baseline data is usually simpler to collect, but not always. And collecting baseline adequate data is sometimes logistically difficult, expensive, it might be seasonal, highly technical, especially in the deep sea, remote areas of forest and wetland systems or where there are migrant resource uses. So when doing an EIA, one mustn't underestimate the effort required to collect appropriate baseline data. Mitigation hierarchy, as I mentioned, is something that's been talked about more and more these days and is a requirement. There's plenty of information out there on how it goes, but basically it's to do with avoidance, minimization, restoration, and offsets. There are challenges collecting data, and one can use other sources. For example, bathymetry can give you good information of the environment on the bottom of the sea, from which you can ascertain whether or not certain marine communities or habitats are there based on the relationships with the geomorphological features. For example, steep rocky walls will tend to have deep water corals, and flat open plains are generally fairly lifeless. There are a number of guidance documents. Yes?
Matt, if I can just interrupt you for a minute, can I ask you to wrap up your presentation so we can give also Rita a chance to present on the practitioner perspective?
Rita,
thanks.
I think we're over to you. Here we go.
Thank you, Matt. And thanking everyone for tuning in to this webinar. I would now like to pick up from where Matt has left and discuss the Kenyan experience on the challenges in conducting ESIA in the upstream oil and gas sector from the platform of the Environment Institute of Kenya, which is the body of the professional practitioners who conduct the environmental and social impact assessments in Kenya. Just a view of the discussion. We'll look at the Kenyan upstream oil and gas industry, the environmental framework that is in place, and then move on to look at the various challenges that we have experienced as practitioners. The oil and gas industry in Kenya has predominantly been a downstream industry, basically on refinery production as well as storage and marketing. Upstream oil and gas is therefore a nascent industry in terms of exploration and production in Kenya. And oil was first discovered in 2012 by a British firm, the Tullow Oil. Kenya has 4 prospective sedimentary basins, most of which are onshore, that is the Anza, the Mandera, and the Tertiary Rift, but the Lamu Basin extends offshore. Kenya as a country on the East African side of Africa has an environmental framework. We have the Constitution of Kenya 2010 that provides for every citizen to have a safe and healthy working environment. Kenya has a national environment policy dated 2014. Matt mentioned about environmental legislation coming into effect largely from the year 2000. In Kenya, the overarching Environmental Management and Coordinating Act came into effect in 1999 and has recently been updated in 2018. This act, normally called the MCA Act, has got various regulations in support of it. Key among this is the Environmental and Impact Assessment Regulation of 2003. There is also the Waste Management Regulations, the Air Regulations on Ambient Air Quality, Noise, and Excessive Vibrations, among others. As recently as January 2019, the Petroleum Act came into effect, and this is now the legislative framework that's guiding exploration and production of petroleum resources in Kenya, right from contracting to exploring to development and production. Again, in January 2019, we have the Energy Act that also embraces the activities of the upstream oil and gas sector. As indicated by Matt, in terms of the ESIA process, it is pretty much similar in Kenya to many other countries. And it would start with screening of the project applications, then scoping and going on into determining the need for a full assessment study that should guide the mitigation measures that should be in place so that the projects can get licensing. As indicated by Matt, most of these upstream oil and gas projects will have funding from donors, particularly who prescribe to the Equator Principles or the IFC standards. So as a practitioner, one of the first things that you have to address as you kick off and start conceptualizing the process that you will undertake is to make sure that you are able, therefore, to satisfy the requirements of the IFC or the donors of the project, in addition to the local requirements for undertaking EIAs. So in Kenya, we do have, indeed, the EIA legal requirements, but for the upstream oil and gas projects, usually this needs to go beyond to satisfy the ESIA requirements of the donors. Infrastructure is another key challenge. The industry in Kenya is nascent, but most of these projects, as we have seen on the location of the sedimentary basins, are in areas where infrastructure is still growing, it's still not adequate enough. For example, when it rains, the roads may become impassable. In terms of access to water and sanitation, this would be limited. For you as a practitioner, when you need to have even access to electricity, the rate might be low. In terms of emergency response capabilities in the course of undertaking the ESIA, this may be limited, as well as the specialized equipment and laboratories that you would require in terms of specialized equipment for analysis. This may not be available locally, and in terms of laboratories, the samples that are taken would need to be taken out of the country for analysis. Matt mentioned again the requirement and the need for having baseline data so that you have a good and very sound platform to be able to predict the impacts of the project. In many cases in the country, there is lack of sufficient data on the environment, both onshore and offshore, so that you can be able to fully evaluate the potential impacts. For instance, if it's the ambient quality data that you will need, you will find in the areas that the upstream oil and gas activities are happening, there will be no monitoring stations and there will be no ambient air quality data. Where there is surface water, there will be no data available. If it's there, it's probably not coherent or sufficient. For part of the baseline data collection, one would require to also collect data on groundwater. There'll be lack of this data. There'll be lack of data as well on marine and terrestrial species. If it's an offshore, you will need data as well, baseline data, and often you will find that this information is not available. So what does this mean for you as a practitioner? This then means that you have to go out and collect the data. This is a process that needs careful planning. It needs careful attention so that you're able to execute the data collection in such a way that you are able to collect adequate and sufficient, accurately data for defining the baseline condition. And as Matt indicated, particularly if this is a project that needs to be done to the IFC standards, the criticality of the baseline data is something that needs to be carefully thought of. So planning, one needs to think about the local expertise that is available, reliable technical expertise that would be there, because you would need to work with the local people to a very good extent to be able to collect the data. Sometimes there's lack of just this technical expertise on the ground. The equipment has to be the proper equipment that you will need to collect your data. Normally, you will not find this equipment locally and you will have to import it. Once it comes onto the ground in the country, you need to start thinking about the logistics of where to site the equipment. How are you going to secure it in terms of its safety and security? You need to think about weather unpredictability. You need to think about installation, commissioning, calibration, maintenance of this equipment. And all this normally for a long period of time, because data collection for baseline can stretch well over a year. And even in the actual collection of the samples, there might be some safety risks involved in the actual collection process. Legislation is another challenge that we have in the country. Well, the main overarching act came into effect in 1999. The current legislation for environmental and impact assessment was effected in 2003. And as I earlier said, this legislation basically covered downstream activities of refining and storage. This legislation does not cover upstream activities of oil and gas field development, construction of the pipelines, which could be quite expensive, construction of oil and gas separation, processing and handling and storage facilities on the oil rigs, as well as construction of refineries. And a key project to think about in the Kenyan context is the LAPSET project, which is a transboundary project, the Lamu Port South Sudan Transport Corridor project, which has about 7 elements, and amongst these elements is a construction of a refinery. So the ESIA legislation does not cover all these upstream activities. However, it is worth noting that there's been a lot of effort in the Kenyan legislative framework to come up with new and revised legislation that would be able to embrace these emerging issues in the country. The legislation is also, as it stands, the 2003 legislation does not provide very clear guidelines on conducting public participation and consultation. And this oftentimes has led to public consultation being deemed to be inadequate in terms of inclusivity, particularly for women and youth and the physically challenged. Standards are another challenge that we face as practitioners in the country in undertaking ESIAs for the upstream oil and gas sector. We lack standards for soil and groundwater contamination. We have water quality regulations of 2006 that provide standards for surface water contamination. With regards to soil and groundwater contamination, there are no standards, so we've had to rely on other standards, for example, the Dutch standards or the Australian standards in terms of target values and intervention values. Again, a key waste that comes out of the upstream oil and gas activities are the drill cuttings. And we do not have, as it were, a standard that defines what the cleanup criteria would be for the drill cuttings to be deemed to be clean, and therefore you can now, for example, say you can safely bury the drill cuttings or dispose of them responsibly. With regards to analysis, there is a challenge when it comes to accurate analysis of primary pollutants that you'd be interested in as a practitioner, particularly for parameters like total petroleum hydrocarbons, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, because this would require very sensitive gas chromatography methods, which are able to detect low limits, which may not always be available locally. A key challenge again comes for the practitioner when it comes to assessing potential impacts. As well said by Matt, you need to be able to predict the impacts. For example, when it comes to predicting the airborne impacts on air, specialist studies are required in terms of air dispersion modeling. This study is usually costly, there is little local expertise, and there are various models out there to very different details. And as it is right now, there are no clear guidelines of the air quality models that we should adopt so that we have consistency and equity in terms of assessing the impacts. The same thing would apply also when it comes to assessing noise impacts. You need, again, as a practitioner to do noise modeling. There are, again, various models out there. They are costly. We do not have a lot of local expertise. And again, there is no legislation that governs which are the models that we should go for so that we have some consistency in assessing the impacts. Oil and gas projects are usually vast, and because of this, usually they end up in a situation where there is displacement of people. It is very important, once again, to be able to accurately assess the socio-economic impact of these projects, and there needs to be very good expertise when it comes to critical analysis of the data that is collected, as well as, first of all, defining very clearly which are the parameters that need to be collected to be able to very accurately assess the socio-economic impact, and thereafter very good analysis to be able to clearly define the landtake risks of the projects that will define, therefore, which are the most optimal resettlement action plans that will be devised, as well as the livelihood restoration plans. There is little local expertise on this, and again, as indicated, biodiversity impacts for oil and development are usually huge, but the current EIA process that we have in the country has no standard methodology of predicting biodiversity loss. Consultation for the ESIA practitioner is a challenge in the country. Communities are not always very receptive to the process, and if you need them to come and sit and you have that engagement, normally they will need some little incentive to come. They will not just come and sit there for nothing. So for you as a practitioner, you'll have to take this into account because it is the reality on the ground. Another key challenge when it comes to the consultation is the perception that the local content build is just on paper. There seems to be some measure of mistrust when it comes to actualizing the promised benefits of the project on the community. Most communities, again, you will find that they have some reservations in disclosing locations of traditional shrines, and if this information is withheld during consultation, it does impact on the project during the implementation phase. And of course, for you as a practitioner, you will always need to plan in terms of time and the budgetary resources to be able to undertake a very good and sound consultation, and this may be a challenge sometimes. Government planning has presented challenges for the ESIA practitioner when it comes to undertaking the ESIA, because there are instances where you have lack of integration of the environmental considerations with planning, right from the policy level to the project level, where the environment and social impact assessment is perceived to delay the project. And so you have projects commencing without an EIA in place. And a typical example is the early oil pilot scheme that we have in the country. The EIA was just recently completed last year. So for you as a practitioner, well, now you have to do an ESIA at this stage. Retroactive consultations therefore have to be done. And when you get to the people there, they ask you, why are you asking us these questions when already decisions have been made? So in principle, the retroactive ESIAs that are done actually undermine the EIA process. The government has had challenges in terms of capacity, in terms of manpower, to be able to undertake the necessary reviews, also in terms of the technical capacities to review oil and gas, upstream oil and gas sector ESIA. When you think about also the social expertise that is required to assess the resettlement action plans and the livelihood restoration plans, this has been a bit limited, and also the government has been constrained, limited in terms of the technical instruments and tools that are required, particularly laboratories, as well as the fundings that is required. We cannot talk about challenges without talking about corruption. Kenya as a country is grappling with corruption to a very serious scale. And in terms of ranking, it has been ranked 144 out of 180 countries by Transparency International. Kenya has a score of 27 points, which is well below the world average of 43 in terms of the corruption index. For the practitioner, corruption basically means the process is undermined. It means the process is compromised, and also it takes even a longer time. When there are conflicts of interest with political influences on the project, this invariably ends up undermining the process, even when it comes to issuing of licenses. There have been very clear cases on the ground where corruption has to be in place for license to be issued. Of course, this is not healthy, and for the practitioner, again, it comes up to the individual and their level of integrity to see that they're able to undertake the ESIA process to a level that is of integrity and above board. So I would like to just say these are some of the challenges we have faced as practitioners in Kenya. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, our industry is nascent, it is just growing. The environment framework is being built to be able to embrace the challenges, particularly from the legislative perspective. Again, the LAPSET project, which I mentioned, is a project that is transboundary. For the ESIA practitioner, this presents a challenge because there's currently no defined mechanism for transboundary EIAs. And of course, the ESIA process will differ from country to country, depending on the conventions they've subscribed to, as well as their legal instruments. So for you as a practitioner, you need to look at all the requirements from the different countries and see how you can merge this into a document that will be acceptable, not only to the individual countries as well as to the donors who may be requiring you to produce the study to the IFC standards. Of course, they'll need to unify the EIA documents. If this happens, it will actually make the process more seamless. I would like to therefore stop there. I've just highlighted some of the challenges we have faced as a country. I'm sure most practitioners have faced similar challenges, but this is the Kenyan experience. And thank you very much. Welcome back to you, Matt.
We'll have some concluding remarks right now from Matt. Thank you very much, Rita, for your presentation. Matt, can you just take a few minutes to then just conclude this presentation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rita. You covered nicely some of my slides on the challenges of the local consultants. So now what I'm going to do is just summarize with a couple of slides on what are the main features in upstream oil and gas, and then some of the challenges faced by consultants and regulators and the way forward. So with upstream, what you'll notice is generally the activities are short term. A well takes 2 or 3 months, and within 4 months, onshore well, there'll be nothing left, they go away. The seismic survey likewise can be several weeks. So they tend to be short-term activities. There are generally low risks of significant impacts if mitigation is followed, excluding, of course, an accidental blowout, which can happen if mitigation measures aren't followed. The risk is increased, but generally speaking, the risk is very low, and we're talking about an accidental blowout, 1 in something between 2,000 and 6,000 wells. So the risk of a blowout is pretty low, and it gets lower every day as technology improves. Waste management is often the biggest local challenge. Accredited waste facilities and, as Rita mentioned, analytical laboratories tend to be lacking in many parts of the world, which is a challenge for the consultant, but also a challenge for the proponent who wants to keep a good record. Baseline descriptions can be difficult with deep sea exploration, although even there are now technologies and there are teams that can use the remotely operated vehicles to take video footage and to take samples around the well before the well even gets started. So technology is there to improve that. Decommissioning and cumulative impacts. These analyses often are weak in EIAs. From many EIAs that I've seen, the decommissioning usually has a few phrases like, yeah, decommissioning plan will be put together when the project is finished in 20 years' time, and that's it. Now, it's something that's happening a lot now, and you'll see it around the world. Decommissioning is becoming a big issue and a big business, because lots of offshore, especially wells and pipelines, have finished performing and they need to be removed. Cumulative impacts also is an area of weakness. Local regulators may have a poor understanding of upstream activities and the proponent, which is a challenge. Emergency accidental events may be difficult to prepare for. If you compare somewhere like the Gulf of Mexico, where there are probably 300 helicopters used daily and several hundred supply vessels and all sorts of health and safety material and equipment and expertise, compared to East Africa, where there's basically none. The guarantees for oil spill fund or decommissioning are difficult to secure, especially from smaller international oil companies. And there are global issues and variable demand for gas, the local and the global level, for gas and oil, especially for gas, which makes it difficult for companies and countries to predict when they should drill and when they should hold back. And there are differences between companies who may influence the EIA process. Some of the main weaknesses and the risks are that ESA reports should ideally be freely available to the public, for example, online. The follow-up documents of the ESA are rarely publicly available and ought to be. The public participation is often limited to the scoping phase of an ESA process. And stakeholders often have distorted expectations and or incorrect information leading to dissatisfaction or even violence in some places. Some countries, the ESA process is weakened to speed up the development. The government might say, no, we're going to drill. We said we're going to drill. Yeah, let's not bother with this EIA thing. It just delays everything. That does happen. There are often weaknesses in local governance which may exacerbate or worsen the impacts. For example, illegal logging in new areas opened up by seismic tracts may even be encouraged by certain elements of local authorities. The investment climate affects development, as Rita explained with Kenya, Tanzania also has a pretty low investment ranking these days compared to somewhere like Denmark. And this creates a risk for the investor. Remember, the investor has to spend their money up front when they go and undertake seismic or drilling. And lastly, political and social stability and security can slow down development. There's a case in point right now in northern Mozambique where LNG projects completely halted because of security concerns. Moving forward, what we all need to aim for is transparent win-win agreements and a good profit share for the recipient countries. Internationally recognized EIAs, we have to insist on the highest standards. Capacity building, local content, and job opportunities should be maximized wherever possible and realistically maximized. Non-political oil revenues for national development are certainly a way to go if we follow the Norway example, where the profits from oil and gas cannot be politicized. Waste management, again, needs support for development and it needs to be monitored, as do all operations and implementation of the Environmental Social Monitoring Plan. The ESMP is a critical part of an EIA, and it needs to be implemented and it needs to be followed up. Sensitivity mapping, especially for coastlines, but also for terrestrial areas, support for academia and the involvement of training and postgraduates, critical for developing your own skills base in country. Oil spill contingency plans and transboundary coordination. This is something that Rita touched on. I see it always as a problem. It's yet to happen, but it will. And there needs to be more regional coordination. The oil spill insurance bond and enforce the polluter pays principle. That should be enshrined in any kind of exploration activity. Managing stakeholders' expectations and those of government itself. Tanzania, a decade ago, Tanzania was going to be the first country in East Africa with LNG. It's not happening. And everybody got very excited about it, and the price of land went up all along the coast. These things happen. You have to keep stakeholders informed, and last but not least, increase the focus on climate change and human health throughout the whole process. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you very much. And we do have good time to have a good discussion, and there are a number of questions already on the platform. And so it's really great. Thank you both again for the presentation. But let me start. I mean, I know, Matt, there's so much material, I mean, that we could actually present and discuss with respect to EIAs and ESIAs for upstream, just for upstream oil and gas. But I wanted you to kind of go back to this concept that you introduced on the mitigation hierarchy, and just kind of presents also from a practitioner's perspective, how is this mitigation hierarchy applied in practice, and how does that link back to the polluter pays principle? And I'd like to hear Rita's perspective on that as well.
Okay, thank you, Marisol.
If you can just go back to what is the mitigation hierarchy, and then how is that really applied in practice within the EIA context?
Yeah, well, I must say, from my experience, the mitigation hierarchy is somewhat of a new recent development. And really, it's a tool, and I'm quoting from the slide, which I skipped through very quickly there, which is to help sustainable management of natural resources. So it's a tool. In the old days, you would just say, okay, we're going to minimize an impact on the forest, and that's it. We may plant it when we finish and go away. But this is a much more structured tool. And one has to demonstrate, when one borrows money from some of the big lenders that insist on this procedure, one has to clearly demonstrate that every effort has been made to avoid an impact through the site selection, through the design process, through the scheduling, like I mentioned with let's say we have migrating whales. So an avoidance mechanism for seismic surveys, you don't do it when there are migrating whales because there are impacts of seismic on whales. So that's an example. And then if you've exhausted all your efforts to avoid an impact, then you want to minimize it. So if the example of the whales, again, if you couldn't do it, so you would minimize it by using special air guns in your seismic rig that had the least impact. So there are physical controls, there are operational controls. You could decide you were only going to do it in the daytime. You were going to decide you would watch the ocean for whales and things like that. And there are abatement controls where you reduce certain elements. Then once you've gone through all that, and you know there's going to be an impact, you then consider restoration. Now that's difficult with whales, but it's easier perhaps with forests or certain terrestrial habitats, or perhaps even coral reefs, where you re-establish, and you have to demonstrate how you're going to do it. You re-establish the biodiversity values, you re-establish ecosystem services. Now this can cost a lot of money. In some places you'd have to reconstruct a coral reef. And then finally, that's the offset, where you would actually build a new coral reef, or you would fund the development of a coral reef or a protected area in an adjacent location. So this mitigation hierarchy, it's now becoming law, really, from as far as the lenders are concerned. And the emphasis on the EIA consultant, usually involving a mitigation hierarchy specialist, somebody who's been in that sector in the industry and has a lot of experience and can work out how to present these efforts of prevent, mitigate, restore, and offset. Marisol, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you. Rita, would you like to add to that? I mean, based from your experience from the sort of EIA practice in Kenya, how have you used this mitigation hierarchy principle?
Thanks, Marisol. From my own personal experience, as a principle, it is not a requirement that you would find from the national level, but as Matt has indicated, it is a requirement that is increasingly becoming more important from the international level, from the lenders, particularly the IFC. So as Matt clearly indicated, it is a new principle that we're having to embrace from the practitioner's point of view. And as it were, it is intended to make sure that the process is very clearly thought out so that the final outcome of the project makes it very sustainable and the impacts are very well mitigated. And the process is actually a thinking process, a systematic thinking process, as Matt says, where you start with avoidance and go into prevention and offsetting the residual impact. So it's something that we're also having to grow in the country in terms of embedding it into the ESIA. Now that it's not a legal requirement, again, for these projects, the upstream oil and gas projects, because they've got some lender funding, it is something we'll have to increasingly embrace. Yeah.
Thank you. There were also some comments from the platform about the difference between SEAs, which I think Matt had introduced, strategic environmental assessments, or sort of taking a regional approach to EIAs, and EIAs. And you know, you outline some of the advantages of why some countries, such as Norway, take a regional approach, or other countries have also started looking at doing a strategic environmental assessment of the sector. Could you just go over some of those advantages and disadvantages, and why then are not many countries embracing this approach as a way to make the EIA process more efficient for oil and gas projects?
Okay, well, I'll start on that one. Yes, I think we had a question here from, well, I don't have the author of this question, but yes, the satellite activities, small EIAs. Indeed, it's a good observation. And the strategic environmental assessment is actually something that's quite new. It's not as new as the mitigation hierarchy, but it is new, and it seems to be, from my observation, being adopted more and more around the world. So, for example, in Tanzania, Zanzibar now has an SEA strategy for oil and gas sector. Tanzania was developing one. Lebanon are in the process of developing one. And it seems to me that is a sensible way to go. The strategic environmental assessment is in some way what the Norwegians have done. They call them regional assessments. The regional assessment, in Norway has to use some sort of petroleum regulations which apply to everybody. Well, an SEA would be a sector-wide kind of guidance document that would enshrine a number of procedures. All operators would have to follow these procedures. So the EIAs for one activity would be much simpler, much quicker, because you've already written the kind of rules book. And I would see over the next 10, 15 years, a lot more SEAs playing a larger role around the world in guiding the oil and gas sector, and other sectors as well, hunting, mining, tourism, big important sectors that involve a lot of stakeholders and natural resources, tend to be, in my view, being governed more by the strategic environmental approach.
Thanks, Matt. Yes, I think my understanding is also the same, that SEA is not as old as the EIA sort of practice and legislation that that came from the Rio Declaration, and so there's more and more practice on SEA. But my understanding is that many countries don't have legislation on SEAs, and therefore the practice in countries have lagged behind, although there is interest to do it from a practical point of view.
Exactly. We've been working recently in Mozambique, and there is an EIA regulation which has been updated recently, which is great, and addresses oil and gas. And right now they are finalizing their SEA. So the SEA seems to have like a 20-year lag on EIAs. I don't know what's happening in Kenya, Rita.
In Kenya, we are also now coming up with legislation for SEA. You're right, we've had the EIA legislation since 2003. The legislation is now being reviewed to incorporate ACAs as well. Yeah.
Great. I do have a question then specifically from Rita's perspective, and when you've done EIAs in Kenya, what do you see as the role that civil society organizations can play in strengthening the public participation process? But what are some of the obstacles to that?
I think, as I mentioned, one of the challenges that one would face as a practitioner is being able to get the community, the stakeholders together and have that engagement. There's been a lot of skepticism as to the whole process. I think partly because, as I said, some of these ESIAs are being done retroactively, but indeed the civil society usually have this very special place where they're able to I think bond with the communities and the relevant stakeholders on the ground, and they would be very handy, particularly in helping get the true message of the project on the ground. As I mentioned, part of the challenge in terms of delivering the consultations is usually the skepticism that, after all, even if we do these projects, the local content doesn't trickle down to the people, the benefits will not come to us. But I think the civil society can stand in the gap there to make sure that the true picture in terms of the full disclosure of the project, in terms of the benefits, as well as the challenges and the mitigations that have been lined out, are able to come out clearly to the stakeholders. The civil society is strong when it comes to getting this to the people. And as I mentioned, for example, the LAPSET project, it is having challenges on some of the elements of the project. But it's because I believe the civil society has come up very strongly to help educate the community on the real, actual, factual elements about the project. Yeah. So,
I mean, coming back to like looking at potential impacts, which both of you have discussed in your presentations. I mean, from your point of view, I mean, Matt, you made a list of sort of a good summary of some of the key issues that are being raised, but if you were to be asked, what are the top 3 really biggest sort of potential impacts from an environment social perspective that you would, as an EIA practitioner, really look at right now with respect to upstream oil and gas?
Rita, I'll take a lead. Right, from my perspective, and that's been working on, I've worked on over 15 oil and gas upstream EIAs in different parts of the world. I would say waste management. The issue of waste is the biggest issue.
Sure.
And we're not talking, mega oil spill type thing here, but from normal operations, handling waste, what can happen to waste, taking it ashore, handing it over to local authority. We really need, with waste, one really needs to do is the cradle to the grave philosophy that needs to be applied here. So waste, management of waste, and issues about waste, chemicals, oil wastes, those are the ones that, to me, that I always see lingering in the background, in the shadows, little unlabeled barrels of chemicals There haven't been.
So yeah, when you talk about waste, you know, are you? I mean, I guess you're mainly referring to drilling, from the drilling operations, like the drilling cuttings, the fluids that are used. Waste. So both from chemical waste and the actual drill cuttings when they start drilling is also a big waste issue. Correct? That's what you
correct.
mean by waste, the waste stream that's generated?
Yeah, there's the cuttings waste, which is not an issue when you're drilling on land, because when you drill on land, you use a water-based drilling fluid, which is non-toxic. And generally that's buried and then topsoil is put on top of it, and it's not a big issue. When you're drilling at sea, you need to use an oil-based drilling fluid because the depths are deeper and there's more risk by using water-based drilling mud. This is what the engineers tell me anyway. So when you're drilling at sea, you need to use an oil-based mud. Now they're getting less toxic these days, but it's still an oil-based product, and that needs to be handled. And then you've got all the, you know, waste chemicals and oily sludges and engine oil and all these things which tend to get mixed together, and then they get taken ashore where they should be incinerated with proper incinerators. And then you've got miscellaneous solid waste which tend to be recycled. But it's the chemical residues that. And it's the small, medium-sized operators, which are the biggest risks with respect to waste. The larger, kind of the big majors, tend to have a system for dealing with it, which ticks all the boxes.
Yeah, I think this is. Sorry, go ahead, Rita.
Sorry, I just wanted to add on to what Matt had said. Indeed, just to echo that waste is a big issue. But like, again, from the Kenyan perspective, again, we've had the operations that just began. And I think for the Kenyan scenario, there has been a big challenge. It's onshore, but there's been a big challenge in how the waste would be managed. And the waste, the drill cuttings have had to be stored for a very long time, just on a holding basis as it awaits a very clear path on how this waste will be handled, how it will be cleaned out, and finally to be disposed of. And as again I said, in Kenya, we still do not have regulations on how you will handle this drill cuttings waste, what are the cleanup criteria, so that this is, you would say, the acceptable of handling the waste. Of course, in addition to the chemical wastes that have to be handled and all other challenges that have presented themselves,
Yeah, I think what's interesting from this discussion is, I mean, this is such a huge issue, the waste streams, but making a distinction between the waste that is generated from the actual exploration, drilling, and production, and then the waste, the sort of secondary waste that is generated because of the number of people just actually required to do all of these activities, who live in the camps, and the solid waste management, and the diesel that is used for the trucks that could coming and going to bring supplies. This, you know, so there is all levels of waste that have to be, you know, identified, categorized, and part of that EIA process when you're starting an operation. And I think that's, I mean, I think it's great that you raise this as a major issue, because often, you know, activities start and then they start thinking about the waste management issue only after or during. And that's really very, very hard to manage at that point, like what Rita was mentioning in Kenya, what they have, and Kenya is not an exception. There's many countries who have this problem about because setting up a hazardous waste management facility, right, to handle oily waste takes a couple of years to plan, design, and actually implement. Countries need to start thinking about waste management and you know, tendering it and finding the right operators to actually have the experience to develop hazardous waste facilities, which you don't necessarily have, especially if the oil and gas sector is new. So these are really some of these issues that are very, very important. Is there any other issue besides chemicals and waste that you would, as an EIA practitioner, really sort of have in mind when you're looking at potential impacts? Is there any other issue that you'd like to raise and flag?
One that worries me a lot is with seismic surveys on land. I've been in areas, and again in parts of southern Tanzania, where the seismic survey line needs to extend, let's say, 20 kilometers into the bush, which is and it needs to be cut through forest to allow vehicles to get in and out. And you just go away thinking, okay, when the seismic survey is over, there's now a road right there. And of course, somewhere like Tanzania, where solid wood is used as a fuel and for charcoal, you know, it's a tricky one. It doesn't apply to all parts of the world, obviously, but it opens up access and it fragments certain kinds of terrestrial habitat. And that's always a concern for me. And it's one that I would imagine that once the seismic survey is finished and they've all gone away, that who's left to make sure that that track isn't then reused by logging guys who get in there and get into forest protected areas and whatnot. So that's something that can leave a legacy. If you fly over parts of Africa, you see these long straight lines on the landscape. You think it's a road, but it's a seismic line from the 60s, and they're still there today, 50 years on. Because nowadays the technology is better. The tracks can be narrower and they can go around baobab trees instead of going through them. But still, there is a footprint that's left behind, which is something that worries me in certain parts of the world, especially where the forest is an issue.
Okay.
And also these are wetland transition zones. Go ahead, Rita. Go ahead.
Yeah, for me, one of the things that worries my mind is when I think about accidental events like a blowout. I think in terms of the emergency preparedness, I feel this is not adequate, but it is a reality that can occur. And when you think about the scale of the damage that it can result into, and when we look at the emergency, even the national emergency response plans, this is one upcoming event that needs to be taken into account and incorporated in the future plans. I know these are being reviewed, and I think it would be worthwhile to make sure that there's enough thought given to how to handle this kind of emergencies, because we've never had this before as a country, but it can happen. Yeah. Okay.
No, I think that's great. I mean, I saw that you raised this as an issue, and I think it's great that that is part of the EIA process, is to look at the emergency preparedness, because you mentioned blowout, but actually, I mean, it can also be any type of regular spill. It can be a chemical spill or a regular oil spill that comes because, you know, you have lots of trucks coming and going. You know, you need fuel to drive the drilling operations, and so therefore, you know, a regular spill doesn't even have to be a blowout, can really happen, and this is also should be part of the EIA process when you're looking at, let's say, drilling operations. So maybe I'll maybe have one more question that I wanted to raise. That you mentioned, Rita, like air quality monitoring, and there was I think a comment or a discussion on the platform about, you know, the link. How can we look at climate change issues as part of the EIA? And so I wanted to ask you both. I mean, how does the EIA, how can the EIA process contribute to reducing or addressing greenhouse gas emissions, from your experience and what you know? Rita, would you like to start?
I think the EIA process is as a planning tool would help in making sure that these considerations are taken on board very much early on as we're conceptualizing the implementation. This therefore means that, of course, for the upstream oil and gas sector, you cannot rule out emissions totally, but there can be measures and means to make sure that this is, again, avoided or minimized to a very good extent. In designing, for example, the flaring systems, you can have very enhanced flaring systems that can make sure that whatever is finally emitted there is something that is more friendly to the environment instead of the greenhouse gases. As well as when it comes to the actual operation, you can the system can be designed in such a way that production of the greenhouse gases is minimized. You have mechanisms that can even synthesize some of these hazardous gases into less toxic gases before they're emitted to the atmosphere. Of course, again, for the sector, it will not be zero, but there are efforts that can be put in to minimize the impacts. Yeah.
Matt,
Yeah,
would you like to?
I can add from that an experience. I had to visit a drill ship a few years ago off the coast of Tanzania, and there they were trying to do their drilling to the highest standard. They calculated in advance how many tons of different greenhouse gases would be emitted. They have a spreadsheet for every single combustion engine in the operation, the volumes of the certain kind of fuel that was being used, and the resulting emissions could be calculated. And they had these updated spreadsheets. Now, part of the ESMP, it's really critical. I can't emphasize it enough. The EIA doesn't stop when the certificate is issued. The environmental social monitoring plan is a critical part of it. It follows the project. And part of an ESMP for a drilling program would include regular maintenance and checks of all emission equipment. So you would be able to ensure, and again, the big players are quite happy to do this. It's the smaller ones that probably want to cut the costs. But you can ensure that you are using equipment of the highest standard with the lowest emissions, using the best grade fuel. And this can all be monitored. And that's all you can do. I mean, you've got to drill, you've got to drill. You need to use machinery. But what you don't want to do is use old machinery that's leaking, that's using bad grade fuel, that's putting out more greenhouse gases than it needs to. So there are ways of minimizing the impact.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I see that we have 4 minutes left to the webinar. So I just wanted to maybe our very rich discussion to a close, and I thank our presenters again today for help, facilitating such a rich discussion. As you can see, that there's a lot to cover and to take into account. We hope to then have a number of further webinars that will then take apart some of these issues as we move forward. And I thank all of you who are still online, 584 of you who are still with us until the end of the webinar. And I hope you have found the discussion as rich as I have. Just for a little bit of logistics then to wrap up the discussion, I'll turn to Chidima, who will just flag a few things for us in terms of, how can you get your certificate of participation and access PDFs. So Chidima, please go ahead.
Hello everyone. Just to remind you that the webinar. Hello everyone. Just to remind you that the webinar was being recorded and it will be available for replay at the end of the webinar. And if you're streaming from your phones or your tablets or your laptops, you'll find the presentations ready to be downloaded at the handout section. So if you look at the app, you find like a handout section. If you click on it, you can find the PDF versions of all the presentations that we're giving today. And don't forget, at the end of the webinar, you'll be sent a link to take a survey. It's a short survey for about 5 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes. And if after answering the questions, you would also get your certificate of participation. Then lastly, we'd like to take this opportunity to invite you to join our virtual community of practice on LinkedIn. It's called the Global Network on Environment and Oil and Gas. There you meet with other practitioners and other people with interest in environmental management and oil and gas. And we also have a monthly newsletter, which you will get the link if you want to subscribe. You can also leave your email at the end of the survey to be subscribed to our newsletter. So thank you for joining the webinar again. Over to you, Marisol.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Again, I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you who have joined us from around the world. And I would like to thank our presenters, Matt and Rita, for an excellent discussion. And thank you also to Chidima, who is in our Geneva office, who has been sort of the engine behind our webinar to make sure that we got this far. And finally, I want to thank the Environment Institute of Kenya for co-organizing this webinar with us, and of course, Norway's Oil for Development Program for their support. So with that, I hope we will see you in our next webinar, which will probably be around June, July. So watch this space. You sign up to our global network on environment and oil and gas on LinkedIn so that you are alerted for the next webinar, which will be probably towards the end of June, July, which will then focus on contaminated site assessments and the experience that we've had in other countries in conducting this from oil contaminated sites. Okay, so again, thank you. I would like to say goodbye from Nairobi and thank everyone again.